No, I do not have a pain management problem. I have a pain problem.
Gregory House was the smartest doctor alive. He knew it. Everyone knew it. And his life was still a complete disaster. Not because of the leg, not because of the pills, because of something nobody ever really talked about, including him, especially him. And that's what we're getting into today. He always had a reason to keep moving, a case that wasn't solved yet, a patient who wasn't stable, a diagnosis that didn't quite fit. And when those ran out, he found other reasons. A fight worth starting, a theory worth testing, a person worth provoking just far enough to see what they do. He never ran out of reasons. That's the part worth paying attention to. Not the reasons themselves, the fact that there were always more of them. The Vicodin was real, the leg was real. Nobody who watched him walk across that hospital floor for 8 years would argue otherwise. The infarction happened, the muscle died, and what was left behind was genuine and permanent, and never fully stopped hurting. But the pills arrived into a life that was already organized entirely around motion, around urgency, around the specific relief of having something that needed him badly enough that nothing else had to exist for a while. The infarction gave that pattern a medical explanation. It gave the Vicodin a prescription. It turned a psychological survival strategy into something that could be monitored, debated, treated in clinical terms, argued about in hospital hallways. And House, who had built an entire career on refusing the obvious answer, who had humiliated colleagues for accepting the first explanation that fit, accepted that one completely, without examination, without the one question he asked about everything else. That's the first thing worth sitting with. Peace exhausts him faster than pain. Watch the episodes where the case resolves early, where the diagnosis lands clean, the patient stabilizes, the team disperses, and the ward goes quiet. House doesn't rest. He doesn't feel the satisfaction that should, by any reasonable measure, follow from saving a life. Something behind his eyes goes searching almost immediately for the next problem, the next conflict, the next thing urgent enough to require his complete attention. Because complete attention was the only state in which House seemed to fully exist. Not happy, not comfortable, not at peace, but present, anchored to something real by the weight of a crisis that needed him specifically. Without that anchor, he drifted. And where he drifted, he clearly didn't want to go. He only looks comfortable when someone is dying. That's not a metaphor or an exaggeration. It's a behavioral pattern that holds across 8 seasons with a consistency that starts to feel less like personality and more like architecture. The man was built around crisis the way other people are built around stability. Not because he enjoyed suffering, though he'd let you believe that, and he was exceptionally good at letting you believe exactly what served him, but because suffering, specifically other people's suffering, gave him somewhere to put everything he otherwise couldn't hold. Think about what that arrangement actually provides. Every patient who walked through that door arrived carrying something urgent and unresolved, a body failing in a way that required his complete and undivided attention. And full attention was the only state in which something in House seemed to go quiet. Not the leg, not the hunger for stimulation that everyone around him spent years misreading as arrogance. Something deeper and less nameable that apparently only went still when the problem in front of him was large enough to fill the entire space. The cases were clean that way, legitimate, professionally rewarded, morally unassailable. A man saving lives has a reason to be exactly as relentless and consuming as he needs to be, and people thank him for it rather than asking what's underneath it. The medicine gave House permission to be obsessive in exactly the way he needed to be obsessive, and to receive gratitude rather than concern. It was a nearly perfect arrangement, and House, who was not unaware of the arrangements that served him, understood this one better than he ever acknowledged. His team saw pieces of this without ever assembling the whole picture. They saw the manufactured chaos, the unnecessary provocations, the cases he took that no reasonable attending physician would touch. Foreman read it as arrogance, a diagnostician who needed problems worthy of his intelligence, who was genuinely bored by anything that could be solved conventionally. He spent years trying to find the line between House's brilliance and his self-destruction, and eventually stopped looking because the line kept moving in ways that didn't make sense if arrogance was really the explanation. 13 got closer. She recognized the self-destruction as something deliberate, something chosen, something that had a logic to it even if the logic was painful. But she misread the direction. She thought House was punishing himself. He wasn't. He was managing himself. There's a meaningful difference between those two things. Punishment implies guilt about something specific, some act or failure that needs to be balanced. What House had was more structural than that, a system for keeping certain internal conditions from ever becoming sustainable long enough to require him to address them. Wilson understood more than he ever fully articulated, even to himself. He kept feeding House cases during suspensions, kept finding reasons for House to be needed, kept the emergencies available during the periods when the hospital had every legitimate reason to keep House at a distance. He framed it as loyalty most of the time, sometimes as necessity, the pragmatic argument that a controlled House was safer than an unsupervised one. But watch the pattern across the full run of the show, and something else becomes visible underneath those framings. Wilson was keeping House functional, at the direct cost of keeping House examined. Every case he delivered was also a case he didn't have to watch House sit alone with whatever surfaced in the absence of cases. The pills handled the silence well enough that nobody had to ask what happened when the silence came back. And Wilson, who knew House better than anyone alive, had seen enough of that silence to understand it wasn't something friendship could fix. So he offered problems instead. Urgency. The one currency House would always accept without negotiation. That choice, made hundreds of times across years, quietly and without drama, tells you something specific. Not about Wilson's weakness or his enabling, about what Wilson had seen when the cases ran out and the pills weren't enough and there was nothing left between House and whatever he spent his entire life keeping at a distance. Wilson had seen it, and he'd decided the cases were better. Now here's where the Vicodin story starts to break down in a way that can't be explained away. House got clean, not easily, not without cost, not without the sustained and unglamorous work of genuine withdrawal and the kind of institutional support he'd spent years treating with contempt. He did it. The substance left his life, and when he came back to the hospital, when the Vicodin was genuinely and verifiably gone, the fundamental shape of his existence didn't change. Same restlessness appearing at the same thresholds, same manufactured emergencies in the same situations, same inability to let a quiet moment stay quiet without engineering something into it, same phone calls at 3 a.m., not because the patient needed him, but because he needed the patient. Same fights that didn't have to happen appearing exactly when things were about to stabilize. Same sabotage at exactly the moment when something might have worked. The chemical dependency ended. The underlying behavior didn't move an inch, which means the bottle was never the engine. It was the exhaust. Think carefully about what that reframes. Every conversation about House's addiction across the entire run of the show, every intervention, every ultimatum Cuddy delivered, every moment where Wilson tried to save him by addressing the Vicodin specifically, was aimed at the wrong target. Not maliciously, not out of stupidity. Out of the very human tendency to address what's visible rather than what's causing it. The pills were real, the physical dependency was real. But dependency is never only about the substance, it's about what the substance does to the space between your thoughts. What it makes tolerable that would otherwise be intolerable. What it lets you avoid without appearing to avoid anything. For House, the space between thoughts had a texture that was apparently unsustainable without chemical assistance. And House, who spent his entire career dismantling comfortable explanations, who understood at a professional level that the presenting symptom is almost never the actual disease, who had the diagnostic intelligence to see through exactly this kind of misdirection in everyone around him, let that story stand, accepted it with a completeness he applied to nothing else in his life, never turned his own methodology on himself with any real honesty. That's not a blind spot. Blind spots are accidental. This was protected, maintained with the same precision he brought to everything else, just pointed inward and reversed, because looking directly at it would require deciding what to do about it. And for all his contempt for people who refused to face the truth about themselves, for all the damage he caused in the name of honesty, House had one question he simply would not ask. Not because he couldn't see it, because seeing it clearly would require him to sit with the answer, and the answer had nowhere to go. When nothing needs him, he creates things that do. That's the core behavior, stripped of every explanation that's been layered over it across 8 seasons. Not addiction, not the leg, not the particular tragedy of the infarction arriving at the wrong moment in a life that might otherwise have been different. The relentless generation of necessity. A patient whose case he doesn't need to take. A conflict manufactured in the exact space where quiet was beginning to settle. A problem built specifically to fill the room before silence could. Watch for when it activates, and it activates at the same threshold every time. The moment stillness becomes genuinely available. He jokes exactly when a conversation turns personal, not occasionally, every time, with the precision of someone who has learned exactly how long a sincere exchange can run before it asks something of him. He orders tests that aren't necessary, exactly when a diagnosis is about to resolve, without requiring him further. He escalates conflicts exactly when they were about to de-escalate on their own. He calls Wilson at midnight, not when he's in crisis, but when the evening has gone quiet enough. That crisis might be the only honest response to whatever he's actually feeling. The timing across 8 seasons isn't coincidence. It's calibration developed over decades of practice. Some will push back at this point. They'll say what House had was depression, untreated, chronic, expressing itself as agitation and cruelty and constructed chaos because those were the only emotional registers available to him. That's not wrong, but it's incomplete in a way that matters here. Depression doesn't explain the precision. A mood disorder doesn't teach you to pick fights at exactly the moment a conversation was about to become honest. It doesn't produce sabotage that lands consistently at the precise threshold between a relationship failing and a relationship succeeding. It doesn't generate chaos with the specific, repeatable accuracy of someone who has identified every situation in which genuine stillness might occur and developed a response to each one. That's not a disorder expressing itself randomly. That's a system. Built over decades, refined through use, almost invisible in operation unless you know which threshold to watch. And the Vicodin fit into that system, with a terrible and specific efficiency, not as the origin of anything, as the most effective available management of the system's primary vulnerability. The silence between thoughts, that quality of interior quiet that most people experience as neutral, even restful, had for House a weight that was apparently unsustainable without assistance. Not dramatic, not the kind of darkness that announces itself, just a specific texture of existing without external demand that he had apparently decided, at some point early enough that it no longer felt like a decision, was not something he could tolerate for long. The pills didn't fix that. They muffled it just enough that the next case could start before whatever was underneath had time to surface, just enough that the arrangement kept working. Just enough that nobody, including him, had to find out what was actually there. Getting clean removed the muffler. It didn't change what was making the noise. There's a version of House that surfaces occasionally in the quieter episodes. Not the diagnostician, not the provocateur, not the man performing contempt for an audience he pretends not to need. A version that sits at the piano alone at 2 in the morning and plays something that has no audience and serves no purpose and doesn't solve anything. Those moments are brief and the show doesn't linger on them because House doesn't linger on them. But they're there, and in those moments something is visible that the rest of the show keeps carefully managed. Not sadness exactly, not self-pity, something quieter and harder to name. The expression of someone who has maintained something very difficult for a very long time and is, in the specific privacy of having nothing to perform for, briefly not maintaining it. Those moments never last. Something always interrupts them, or he interrupts them himself. The phone rings, or he reaches for the bottle, or he finds some reason to leave the apartment before the silence can finish whatever it was starting to say. The cases gave him a reason to keep moving. The Vicodin gave the moving a medical explanation. Together they built something that functioned well enough for long enough that nobody, including him, ever had to find out what existed on the other side of both of them being gone. In the apartment, late, in the hours between one emergency and the next, there is the piano. He plays it alone, always alone. Not for Wilson, not for Cuddy, not for anyone who might remember it or ask about it later. The music fills the room, the way sound fills silence, not replacing it, just making it slightly harder to hear what's underneath. The next case will come, it always does. And until it does, he keeps playing, not because it helps, because the alternative is finding out whether anything does.